All right.
Oh,
So
no.
there
Here
you
we
go.
go.
So it's now official recording. All right. So you guys had asked that we do a study on numbers.
Mhm.
So I'm going to share my screen. So there's the screen. Everybody see the PowerPoint okay?
Yeah.
All right. So numbers is part of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Um, when when you think about all the books together, what do you typically think about?
Torah.
Okay, Torah, but what so what does that mean when you say okay, it's the 5 books or the Pentateuch or the Torah? What does that mean? What would that mean maybe for a Jewish person other than to identify, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy?
What's the basis of the whole religion?
Okay, so it's foundational for all that they believe. Okay, great. Anything else?
History.
Okay, history. What about as you approach the type of literature, how is it meant to be used?
Well, it's not apocalyptic. It's
No, it's not apocalypse. Well,
it's
it's
telling about the nature of God.
okay, so tell us about the nature of God.
Instructional.
It's okay, good. We hear the word instructional. When we use the word instructional, what do we mean by that?
Well, it's tells people, I'm just trying to pull it up. It tells people what hey, for lack of a better word, what the rules are.
Okay, yeah. And so
You know,
when you hear
Where
the
are the
word
boundaries?
Mhm. When you hear the word instruction, typically we're thinking about, okay, an instruction manual, a how-to kind of thing. And, for persons that read the Torah in the Jewish tradition, they don't look at so much as an instruction manual or a to-do manual, but it's really designed to be meditative, to have dialogue and those kinds of things. So as we're thinking about numbers, as we think about the books that we've already looked at, and as we look forward to Deuteronomy, kind of keep that in your mind that, in as far as an instruction manual, we typically look at it as, a to-do list or what we can do, what we can't do, where for them, it would be the basis of a conversation in order to have dialogue to kind of discover what's going on. So we're in the book in Numbers, and so all of us have some guttural reactions when we hear the word Numbers or the book of Numbers. So what do you think of when you hear the book of Numbers?
Census.
Census.
Ancestry lists, kind of
And
like family tree.
okay, ancestry list, family tree.
The book of the Bible, period. I don't
Okay.
know anything else about it.
A book of the Bible, but we really don't know a whole lot else about it. Okay. Well, with that said, how many have actually read the book of Numbers?
I've
Parts.
skimmed it. I've never actually sitting with it.
Okay. So first of all, do we all know where the book of Numbers is?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
We're good. Fourth book in the Bible. Some of us have skimmed through it. Some have maybe has anybody started to read it and then just kind of turned off, closed the book?
Mhm.
I
Okay.
feel like I read it in Disciple. Think we read it.
I don't think we read the whole thing. We read picks and parts of it. All right. So what if you think about numbers, you get that thing. What is it all about? So I heard, okay, it's got census, it's got family trees, but if you really had to summarize the book, if somebody was thinking about it, what would a summary be?
7 tribes of Israel heritage.
Okay, the heritage of 7 tribes.
12.
Okay, 12 tribes.
What did I say 7?
We got a couple lost in the wilderness there. They didn't quite make it to Sinai. Anything else?
Well, this thing says it's the first settlement of the Israelites
Okay,
after leaving Egypt.
okay. Anything else? All right,
My
so,
Bible says that it tells the story of how Israel was preparing to enter the promised land.
okay, yep. So, when we think of numbers, it's, that numbers kind of, title, it comes to us actually from, our Christian roots, not so much from our, Jewish roots. So, there's the Greek Old Testament was called the Septuagint. And when the early Christians put the Septuagint together, when they got to this book, in Greek they called it Arithemolai. Okay, and then later on,
Right.
one of the church fathers, Jerome, translated it into Latin, called the Vulgate.
Huh.
And when he made that transition, he called it numeri, where we get the word numbers from. But if you think about it, from a Jewish perspective, they don't call this book Numbers. They have two other ways that they would think about or title the book. And one of those comes if you look at the first 5 words of the text. The 5th word means in the wilderness. So for them, the title of the book really is In the Wilderness, which describes more of a historical context. I mean, somebody said, when I asked what Numbers was about, somebody said, well, it's about that preparing to go into the promised land. So it was that time in the wilderness of preparing. Also, they would look and title it from the first word, and it's the Lord spoke, focusing not so much on the historical and geographic context, but more so on the words of God. I think Debbie had said earlier, when we think about the Torah, what's the Torah about? It's about learning about God. And so if we if we step back a minute and we say, okay, let's jettison the title Numbers, because it gives us these ticks about census and family trees, and we think about it more along the lines of in the wilderness or the Lord spoke. How do we begin to perceive the book a little bit differently? Do we perceive the book a little bit differently?
Yeah, instead of being instructional, it's relational, conversational.
Okay. I think the other thing that tends to happen is when you think about census, or numbers, you think about the census, you think about the pedigree, kind of puts that lock, stock and barrel front and center, where, really, if you think about the census and that stuff, it's just a very small portion of what happens when we read the book of Numbers. All right, and so as we think about Numbers, we also we got to think about it in its context, and so it's one of 5 books which we call the Torah. And if we kind of look at those 5 books as kind of a continuous study from Genesis to Deuteronomy, it's really trying to tell a story. We start in Eden. And so what's Eden all about?
God and people living in right relationship.
Okay, yeah. So it's all about, you know, the relationship not only of God and people, but God and creation, and living in, yeah, that right relationship. And we know that, okay, Adam and Eve messed up and there was an expulsion, and, you know, moving into the wilderness, and then periods of redemption, all trying to move them back into Eden. And so as it's set up, that the idea of the promised land is maybe a foreshadowing of movement back um, into Eden. So when we think about the Torah, we think about the Pentateuch, it's the unfolding story of how God's promises. And if we think about Abraham's promises, that's blessings, people, land are being fulfilled, all with the expressed movement of people moving towards redemption and towards Eden. And if we kind of look at the book of Numbers, and we read the book of Numbers, it's talking about people and it's talking about land. So it's talking about some of those promises that you know, God has made with his people. So, you know, we need to think about Numbers in light of the larger meta narrative. Any thoughts about that? So if you think about this as you know, the setup, and this, as Sue said, this is the foundation that makes sense for the Jewish people, and you know, their religion, what they believe in. What about us as Christians?
Well, this is our shared background too.
Okay, it's our shared background, but how isn't this sort of a overarching structure of what we believe as Christians, and, you know, the movement and the work of Jesus Christ to move us along, that, you know, we are on this path as well. And redemption is not going to come, you know, on Mount Sinai and preparation in the desert, but redemption's going to come through Jesus Christ that moves us into Eden. So this meta narrative is one that you know, is foundational not only for Jewish persons but also for us as Christians. And so if we think about the books and how they're arranged, you'll see that I've kind of color coded them. So Genesis is green, Deuteronomy is green, Exodus is blue, Numbers is blue, and Leviticus is red by itself, because the books are actually paired together and mirror each other. You know, we have Genesis going from the movement of the garden out into the wilderness. And in Deuteronomy, we have the wilderness going into the garden or the promised land. And we have the movement of through the wilderness in Exodus and through the wilderness in Numbers. So if you look at that arrangement, so I said that they parallel one another. If you look at Exodus on the left side of your screen, and you look at Numbers on the right side of the screen, you see how each one kind of parallels the other. You know, one moving from Exodus into the wilderness, and the others moving from Exodus or wilderness into the Exodus. So as you think about how they're set up, you know, we've already talked about Exodus. So a lot of the information that we have there, a lot of the information we have covered there is also, you know, paralleled in Numbers. Anybody ever see that before or think about
No.
that before?
Mhm.
Yeah.
So they're both telling the same story, only a different narrative?
It's not that they're telling a different the same story
same
with a
story.
different narrative. It's part of a continuation of the same story. So, you know, you're going from point A to point B, and then point B to point C. But what happens in those two sections are mirrored.
Okay.
But
So
I
it's-
guess I have the same question that, Nancy's asking, which is, so if you say like Exodus 16, manna and quail, Numbers has that too. Is that the same manna and quail story, just told differently or in a different?
No,
Like-
it's manna and quail being manifest at different times.
In different
Oh.
times.
Yeah, so it's not like Exodus and Numbers are doing exactly the same time. They're two different time periods, but we have similar things happening in those time periods.
I didn't know that there were two different time periods where manna came.
Well, they're both, remember, they're still in the desert. Okay.
Mhm.
So, as we think about this, arrangement, something important to remember is in the book of Genesis and the book of Deuteronomy, the climax of each book is the rising up of a great patriarch, that, on their deathbed forecasts the future. So if you look at that in Genesis, it's Jacob. Okay. In Deuteronomy, it's Moses. And, Moses is kind of lifted up as, one of the prophets of all prophets. But, with Moses, it's not the end of the story. There's this tension that's there that, while Moses was the prophet of all prophets, there's yet to come one that's even greater than Moses. And for us, that's Jesus Christ.
Mhm.
So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a little summary video of the story. So let me just see if I'm going to start it and see if you tell me if you can hear it, because I forgot to enable sound.
No sound.
Okay, great. So hang on, I need to stop sharing for a minute. Stop sharing. Now I need to go to share. Hopefully they didn't move the button.
I found it at the bottom.
Well, the problem is I see the thing there. I just don't see share sound. There it is. It's moved in a different spot.
Hmm.
Okay, so let me share. Oh, what's happened here? Okay, so let me share Numbers again. There we go. Let's see if we hear it this time.
Really boring name.
Which is a
Yes.
shame. In the Hebrew tradition, the book's name
Yes.
is Bamidbar,
Yes.
which means in the wilderness. And it's an epic travelogue about Israel's journey through the desert on their way to the land promised to Abraham.
Now, this pilgrimage should only take about 2 weeks on foot.
But instead, it takes them about 40 years.
That's crazy. It's practically half of someone's lifetime.
Yeah, it's a very long camping trip with lots of interesting stories. But let's remember, it's most helpful to back up and start with how this book is designed.
Right.
So the book is broken up into 5 sections. There are 3 wilderness locations, broken up by 2 road trips that link all the pieces together.
The first wilderness section is Mount Sinai, right here on the map.
And then in the second section, they travel to a region called Paran.
A whole bunch of things happen here in the wilderness of Paran.
And then in this 4th section is Israel's road trip to Moab.
The book ends with a large section in the wilderness of Moab, right across the Jordan River from the Promised Land.
Now, through all of these sections, the storyline just flows like a gripping dramatic movie. Everything starts great, but then the trip goes horribly wrong, and it all ends with the final redemptive moment, the surprising act of God's grace.
So let's jump into this story. It all begins at the wilderness at Mount Sinai, and we've become really familiar with this mountain.
Yeah, if you remember, Israel came here after Egypt, and they formed a covenant with God here, got the 10 Commandments here, built the tabernacle here, and they've been at this mountain for 1 full year.
And now they take a census to number the people as they prepare to leave.
Right, and they're given these instructions for how to organize all those people in the camp. God's presence in the tabernacle, and then the tribe of Levi and the priests around it, and then the rest of the tribes around them. And this pattern, it's this visual symbol for how God's holiness is at the center of their existence as a people.
And they're told that when the cloud of God's presence moves, they're to pack up and travel with it.
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant is carried by the Levites out in front, and then the tribe of Judah, and on and on. And this order is also a symbol for how God's holy presence is their leader and guide through the wilderness.
We begin the second section of the book with enthusiasm as they leave Mount Sinai and travel up to Paran. God's with them, everything's organized. This is going to be great.
But it's not great. After just 3 days on the road, the people are complaining about their hunger and thirst, and then even Moses' brother and sister start bad-mouthing him in front of all the people.
Not a great start. But now we're into the third section, the wilderness of Paran. This is where they send the 12 spies to scout out the promised land. 2 of those spies come back and they're really optimistic.
But the other 10 are freaked out, and they don't trust God, and they go around saying, we're going to get annihilated in there. And so they start a mutiny, and they try to appoint a new leader who's going to take all the people back to Egypt. And so basically, they are refusing to go into the promised land, and God honors their choice. He says that this generation is going to wander for 40 years and die in the wilderness, and only their kids will get to enter the promised land.
You know, this story here gets brought up many times in the Bible by different authors.
Yeah, and it always serves as a reminder that while God remains faithful to his people and his promises, he will honor their choices. He'll let them waste their whole lives if they choose to live in rebellion.
Okay, so the trip's been a disaster so far.
And it gets worse here in this fourth section as they're traveling to Moab. Even Moses has a moment of rebellion and is disqualified from entering the promised land. Then there's another rebellion among the people that results in this snake attack. And what makes all these rebellions even worse is that every step of the way, God has been providing. He's been offering forgiveness. He's been giving them food and water and this crazy stuff called manna.
Yeah, what is that stuff?
Yeah, no idea. But in spite of all this, they keep complaining, and they say that they wish they had died in slavery in Egypt.
If I was God, I would just give up on these guys.
You would think. But that's what makes this story in the final section so surprising. Israel has just arrived in Moab, and the king of Moab, he's freaked out that this huge group of people is traveling through his land. So he hires this pagan sorcerer named Balaam to pronounce curses on them.
This guy means business.
Yeah, and so Balaam, he says, okay, I'm going to pray to the Hebrew God, and let's see what happens. And 3 different times he attempts to curse them, but each time he finds that he can utter only blessing. Most surprising is the last blessing, where he prophesies that out of Israel will rise a victorious king. And this king is somehow going to be connected to God's promise to Abraham to bless all nations through this family. So here's Israel rebelling down in the camp, totally unaware that up in the hills, God is protecting and even blessing them.
The book ends here in Moab. Israel's getting ready to go into the promised land. They count up everyone again, just like at the beginning. They're leaving the old generation behind, including Moses.
But before they leave Moses, he gives them his last words of warning and wisdom. And that speech is what the next book, Deuteronomy, is all about.
Okay, so
Interesting.
I was going to say, what did you think?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know. I like the roadmap, how they explained it.
Okay. Other thoughts?
It's bizarre that you can spend 40 years on a 2-week trip.
Mhm.
Well, that's kind of what happens when you
You don't have a
what you can-
GPS.
Well, we got the
The book of
40
Numbers
Whoa,
gets
what's up?
overlooked, partly because it has a really
What's up? So when you think about that, you chuckle about, okay, there were actually a distance where they could have covered that in a couple of weeks, but they wander for 40 years. And in some ways, we look at that as God's punishment.
Mhm.
Yeah. But what did you hear actually in the video?
I heard, probably incorrectly, but I mean, God has an enormous amount of patience.
Well,
I mean-
you did not hear incorrectly. That is
no matter
extremely
what
true.
he does, and these people still don't get it, and he still chugs on with them, it's just amazing.
Mhm. But and it's interesting that the wandering in the desert, God gave them exactly what they asked for.
Mhm.
God gave them exactly what they asked for. So in some ways, is Numbers one of those books that you kind of can get kind of drugged down with the census and those kinds of things. But it's an important book, and it's got a pretty important message that it's worth considering. So what's the relevance of the book? I mean, if we you know spend some time, spend 5, 6, 7 weeks on a book, what's its relevance, not just for a historical purpose, but what what is God telling us about God here, and how can we here in the 20th century make sense of this material, but not only make sense of it, but also have it speak kind of into our lives. And if we kind of take an overarching look at the book, there's a bunch of different sort of thematic things that we can see: the need to be loved, the need to be free, the need to be clean, and the need to be sure. And so, the book of Numbers helps with each one of those things. So, we all, as part of our natural makeup, want to be loved. Does anybody here not want to be loved? No, we do all kinds of crazy things in order to gain attention, in order to be loved. So we have this natural craving that has echoed throughout the onset of humanity. And so we're designed to be in relationship with other people. Some of us are maybe wired more as introverts rather than extroverts, but even the most introvert amongst us, while they get some of their energy from being alone, needs to be with people. It makes a whole lot of sense. We just came out of a pandemic, it's hard to believe, 4 years ago.
Mhm.
But what was the pandemic all about?
Mhm.
Social isolation.
Mhm.
And what do we find when people are socially isolated?
Mental health crises.
We have
Yeah.
mental health crises. People do crazy things. Okay.
It's
And so really,
interesting. I'm reading a book called The Good Life. Have you read this?
no, I haven't heard of it.
Just came out. I'll give it to you when I'm done. And it's about this Harvard study that was started in like 1938 or something, following a whole bunch of individuals doing, surveys, doing blood tests, all kinds of things, trying to figure out what's making people live longer, what's keeping them healthier. Is it what they eat? Is it what they, exercise, all these things? And one of the stats that they have in there is that social isolation is actually more damaging than smoking, basically.
Oh, really?
Like, yeah, I bookmarked this page. I'm not saying it correctly, but that just like you know what I mean? If you look at the damage that it does to you, shortening your life, it's astonishing.
Yeah. Yep. And so if we look at the book of Numbers, it's all about this idea that here is these people that need to be loved, and here is God that is willing to love them. And in response to that love that they receive from God, they're encouraged to love as well. All right. Also the need to be free. Think about where they were at. you know, are people really designed to live in slavery? You know, they had this innate need to be free. And that freedom that they begin to experience is redemptive. Okay. And so if we look at the book of Numbers, it's also a narrative about a description of this pursuit of what freedom actually is. The need to be clean. Okay. One of the central kind of themes, we talked about it already in Leviticus, is this idea of holiness. And what is holiness?
Closeness to God.
Okay, well, we understand that this idea of holiness, that God is holy. God's holy. Okay. And in order to approach God, we also need to be holy. And the way that we become holy is to be clean. And so if we kind of look at the book of Exodus, it's a graphic illustration of, you know, space, time, organization, and ritual that helps to conform these people into a group of people that are reverent, submissive, obedient, and grateful. There's also the need to be sure. You know, I think it was Nancy. I said, you know, what grabbed you when we watched that video, and the idea that, you know, God is patient, that God is pursuing, that, you know, that same God that put the world into being is that same God that's working here in Numbers to pursue the people. And to assure them that despite all of their grumblings, because there's lots of grumblings, there's lots of the turning of their backs, that God is still there, and they can be sure that God is still present. So the book of Exodus or Numbers is all about a journey, right? And so when we think about that journey, this is what it looks like. You know, we started in Egypt, we came down, went across the Red Sea, went down along the Red Sea down here to Sinai. This is where Sinai is. And then they kind of move, when they move up, they're going to move out and then eventually into the promised land. So when we think about the book of Numbers, from a Jewish perspective, it's a time in the wilderness. And so it's all about that idea of what's happening in the wilderness. How are they being prepared? But when we think about the journey, it's not just that physical journey going from Mount Sinai to Kadesh to Moab. Okay, what we're also seeing in this journey is a spiritual formation, going from you know, the Exodus, where we had the salvation that has begun, that has been put into process, that kind of moves hopefully into completion with the conquest of Canaan, and where they see their salvation complete. So in some ways, they kind of live in this tension where they've experienced the Exodus, so they receive the benefits of salvation, but they haven't moved into the experience of its fullness yet. But the other thing that also happens, another journey that happens in the book of Numbers, is a journey of grace. And I think this, you know, Nance, I think this is what you know was resonating with you. That, you know, God is patient, God is long suffering. Despite all of the grumblings that go on, God continues, and God brings them to the border of the promised land, not because of anything they've done, but actually in spite of kind of what they've done. So yeah, it's all about a journey, but as we begin to think about numbers, as we start to journey through it, remember, it's not just a movement of geography, it's a movement of spirit. It's also a movement of grace. All right. One of the things that we're going to come up against, is laws. We saw a lot of laws in Leviticus, and we're going to see some laws here in Numbers. And as soon as we hear the word laws, what goes through our heads?
Restrictions.
Okay, restrictions.
10 Commandments.
Okay, 10 Commandments.
Enforcement.
Okay, enforcement. So what do you think? So we got a bunch of these laws. We have them in Deuteronomy, we have them in Leviticus, now in Exodus, Leviticus, and now Numbers. So what, we typically as 21st century Christians have some problems with these laws. What are our issues?
They seem to address things that are not modern day concerns.
Okay, so in some ways, do they have some relevance to our lives because they were really laws designed for an ancient group of people?
When you get to the specifics, maybe no, but
Okay,
purpose of them overall, yes.
okay.
It's left to interpretation.
Okay, so they're left to interpretation. Okay.
Other than the 10 Commandments, weren't all these other laws man-made laws?
What do you mean by man-made laws?
They were derived by them for themselves. Didn't they come up with things for themselves that they?
So
Yeah.
you mean, okay, the 10 Commandments were written on tablets. These were not?
Well, they came directly from God. Did
Well-
all the laws in here come from God, or just the 10 Commandments?
No, they're all given to Moses through, they're all from God.
Oh, okay.
Now, what happens is that, you have the laws, and then, like, for example, you need to keep the Sabbath holy. Okay. But then you have other laws that are kind of man-made in the sense that, what does keeping it holy mean? You're not supposed to work on Sabbath. What does that mean? And so you see this snowball of
Yeah.
laws that are trying to define the law. And remember, when I started the conversation tonight, I said, what really should be the design of the Torah? It should be a springboard that causes dialogue and meditation. So what, you have a law, do not murder. Okay. But what does Jesus do with that law in the book of Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount?
He expands it.
He expands it. And in what ways does he expand it?
Well, I believe he moved it into not just physical murder, but if you trash somebody to the point where they can't function in society anymore, that's a kind of murder.
Right. Exactly. And so, God, Jesus would say, well, you've heard it said, do not murder. But I say to you, if you even say raka, to your neighbor, you have committed murder. And so what that's all about is it's not really extending the law, but really forcing one to go back and look at the law, to meditate on the law. and to try to understand, okay, what's the intention of this law? Is it really just, okay, we can't end someone's life, or is it really speaking into the importance of life? And so, when we think about those laws, we think instruction, and if they're just rules of instruction, they don't necessarily, inform us today in the 21st century, which is probably not the best way to look at it. Because think about it for a minute. If we looked at the laws, they constitute about half of the Pentateuch. So half of the 5 books of the Bible is laws. Okay. And if we chop out all of the laws and we read only the narrative, we'd lose probably Exodus 19 through Numbers 10. And so what do you think it would be like if we were to take out all the laws, we create our own Pentateuch, our own Torah, and we take out the laws and we just put narrative and we just read that? What do you think it'd be like?
I don't think it would have the same effect as a law.
Well, you're
And
getting rid of them.
you're talking about like the 600 laws that there are?
Yeah.
Well, then you have recommendations and suggestions,
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
opinions.
Well, you might have a story too with none of that.
Well, that's what I was thinking. You might have a story, kind of like the video that you just showed. I mean, the video wasn't really describing anything about the specifics of the laws, but just giving the narrative.
Right. So, one of the things that we kind of need to think about is what's important with the laws. Okay. And laws, while they, give, do's and don'ts and instruction, they also, help us to understand culture. Okay. There are groups of people called cultural anthropologists, okay, who study laws and study rituals. And they kind of look to those to help to understand a culture. So in some ways, these laws become truths that they believe, but they're expressed visually. Now think about our own history. Okay, we have the history of the United States. Looking at some of the laws as you go through, maybe laws about women's rights, laws about slavery. What do those laws do besides talk about do's and don'ts? They're really kind of talk into what's going on with a culture, and so they become important in that regard. Okay, the other thing we have to remember is that the laws are pretty important if we really want to understand Jesus and Jesus' death. Okay, if we think about the sacrifice that he made, what is it based on? It's based on things that we see in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. So, while we may not want to think about, okay, maybe we shouldn't eat unclean animals, what do they say? What's the broader narrative that they're speaking to as we think about things? Okay. And as I said, they're kind of problems for modern Christians. They take up a little bit of space. So if we expunge them, we lose a lot about what's said about culture. So what we're going to do as we think about our study of Numbers, as they said, it's really kind of organized by geography. So we have a section that occurs that we're going to read about around Mount Sinai. Then there's a little interlude, a travel interlude. Then a period of time about their time in Paran. And then another travel interlude and their time in Moab. And if we kind of look at that a little bit, we can kind of get, okay, what are the actual things that are happening? So in that, like, chapter 1 to 10a, we have the census and the purity laws. Okay, so really beginning to fill out this idea of temple. In Leviticus, we have, the instructions for the temple. And now in Numbers, we have the temple. Okay. And then, the next section, God guiding the people, periods of rebellion, and then also God's provision and protection. So you kind of think about it as movements of temple, test, and land. So that's kind of where we're going to kind of go with things. So it's probably spend maybe two sessions in each little section there. Okay. And so if we look at the structure, they were at Mount Sinai, and they actually stayed at Mount Sinai for about 1 year. So we're there at Mount Sinai for about a year. And then if we look at the second half of Exodus, all of Leviticus, the first chapter of Numbers, that's all about their stay around Mount Sinai. Okay. And if we think about that first section and that year, what was the purpose of that year?
Kind of like a reset point.
Okay. In what sense would you say a reset point?
So they're establishing the temple,
Okay.
and they're beginning to trust that God is with them, and that they're accepting that.
Okay. Yeah. So I like the word reset. But in some ways, I think the reset was a reset from within themselves, going from, a place.
They're learning to think and feel on their own versus being slaves and
Exactly.
talked to.
Exactly. So they're being reset, going from people that were slaves to people who are now free. People that actually, in many ways didn't know much about this God, and now are in the desert and learning about God. So this year just being there and getting set up is a year of this relationship coming together. And then as you kind of think about the next move, it's that relationship as it kind of moves along. So kind of think about, people come out of Egypt, and they're kind of being led. Here they are, and here they're being led by God. Okay, they get to Mount Sinai, they have this relationship, and now they're going to move with God instead of just being led by God. So that's kind of how it kind of looks. And so if we look at the structure, I said we can look at it geographically, Sinai, Kadesh, and then Moab. And, look at it from chapters 1 to 10, 11 to 12, 26 to 36. But we can look at it in two halves. Like the first half is the death in the wilderness. So we have that whole generation of people who refuse to go into this promised land that die off. And then this new generation is going to enjoy life in the promised land. We can also see it, from a spiritual structure where they kind of go from a good beginning, and as they kind of move on, they kind of take a nosedive here, and then they kind of there's an upswing on the spiritual state. So you kind of think about that as they move. So we have the old generation rebels and dies. We have the new generation. We also have a leadership change. In the first half of the book, we have Moses and Aaron. And in the next half of the book, we have, well, it's not really half, the latter parts of the book, we have Joshua and Eleazar. Okay, so when we think about structure, lots of ways to think about structure and how to look at it, you know, from, okay, generational, geographic, spiritual, leadership wise. So lots of different ways to kind of look at this as we kind of go along. Okay, so as we think about this thing, you know, we're at week 1 today. We're going to go 7 weeks. Like I said, we're going to spend 2 weeks in each one of those little sections. So next week, we're going to talk about census and organization. The next week, purity and preparations, challenges in the wilderness, laws, rebellion, atonement, so on and so forth. Okay.
Mhm.
Any questions, any thoughts, comments?
No, not really. I mean, I'm learning it, so I can't really
Yeah.
say too much, so.
I think it
Okay.
may sound a little bit more interesting than first thought, you know.
A little
just a-
bit more interesting. It's not exciting.
It's
Oh,
exciting, yes. I'm
it is.
excited. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't excited about it.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this, idea of you can tell the narrative without the laws, but you really can't because, as you said, it tells you a lot about what's going on in the culture.
Mhm.
Like if you have a law against clubbing seals, it probably means because people were clubbing baby
Yeah.
seals.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, laws typically aren't generated unless there's a need for them to be generated. And like I said, some of the times when we're looking at these laws and that kind of stuff, it's more about you know, looking at it from maybe the 30,000-foot view instead of the boots on the ground view, trying to understand it. All right, so that's kind of the roadmap where we're going to go. And what I'm going to do is stop the recording.